Hello, and welcome to the APICS webinar, Beyond the Horizon, Choosing the Right Capabilities, with Dr. Judy Whipple and Dr. Stan Griffis of Michigan State University. My name is Jennifer Storelli, Associate Editor at APICS. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/online-events starting early next week. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we'll save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click send. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. Again, that's 1-805-617-7000. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this APICS-sponsored webinar, which will highlight recent research conducted at Michigan State University. The research project entitled Beyond the Horizon has been conducted in partnership with APICS. Today's webinar will focus specifically on results of a recent survey examining supply chain capabilities and how these capabilities result in performance improvements. I'm Judy Whipple, and I'm a professor of supply chain management at the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State University and one of the research team members. And now I'd like to invite my co-presenter, Stan Griffis, to introduce himself.
Thank you, Judy. My name is Stan Griffis. I'm also a faculty member at the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State and part of the APICS research team Beyond the Horizons. So to give everybody kind of an idea of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to spend about 5 minutes or so going over what the overall structure of the research project has been, understanding what Beyond the Horizon is, some of the things we've done to date, and then we'll move into the actual findings that we have today for our survey. We've performed a survey, and Judy will give you some great detail on how we've gone about that, but we'll spend about 30, 35, 40 minutes talking about some of those initial findings that we've discovered and communicating those to you. And then for the last part of it, for about 15 minutes, Judy and I will go ahead and take your questions in a Q&A session at the end. When you see this logo on APICS things, you'll understand that we're talking about the Beyond the Horizons project, which is mentioned as a joint venture between Michigan State University and APICS. And what the team of faculty members in the Department of Supply Chain Management at the Broad College of Business at Michigan State have been investigating is what's on the mind of supply chain execs across a various group of global firms. The research team wants to understand how supply chain remains competitive today and into the future. And the specific project, Beyond the Horizon, is funded through APICS, the leading organization in supply chain management, operations management professions, and MSU's McConnell Chair in Business. One of the things you'll have seen if you've been following this research is something that we call the bridge model. The bridge model depicts the challenge of closing the gap between what firms intend to accomplish and how that intent is realized. It's a journey. Firms must understand the various drivers, internal, such as resources, assets, and skills, as well as those that are external, such as technological, regulatory, market, and competitive factors that need to be considered. Drivers, in turn, affect the way a firm is structured, the strategies that the firm can implement, and the best practices that need to be developed within the firm. We find that many firms are stalled on the bridge because implementing best practices is not always enough. Best practices must be unique in the sense that what you do with the practices must offer the potential for differentiation in the marketplace. Practices need to be bundled together to form strategic capabilities, the knowledge and skill that allow firms to coordinate best practices. Capabilities, when combined with the firm's assets, enable competencies to be developed, which in turn yield greater value for the firm. Realization occurs when the developed competencies lead to organizational competitiveness and better performance. This enables the firm to realize its goal, and then you're on the other side of the bridge. As we started the research, we set out to answer a set of key questions. The first of those was, how is supply chain management becoming a strategic asset? Rather than simply being a cost reduction center or performance maximization center, how does supply chain actually become a strategic asset? The second question was, what emerging trends or developments will shape the future of supply chain management? As the name of the project implies, Beyond the Horizon, we're trying to, if you will, look over that next hill, beyond what's presently visible, and try and understand how some of those future developments will affect supply chain management and how supply chain can manage that evolution. The last broad question is related to seeking to discover why some firms are more successful than others despite having seemingly similar tools, systems, and practices. You'll really see more development in this area in today's webinar as we're far enough into the research now to begin to see some of the patterns and groupings among the firms studied in the research. As Judy mentioned, we've got a large team of researchers here at Michigan State that have been involved in this project. I'm not going to go read down through all of these names. They're here for you to refer to, but just know that we've had a very multidisciplinary group working on this project now for a while. The research has been conducted in two phases. The first phase was a series of in-depth interviews with execs from 50 organizations in North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. The interviews focused on strategic initiatives being undertaken, as well as capabilities that firms were focusing on to try and solve today's challenges and take advantage of upcoming opportunities in the future. Some of the things that have come out of this phase of the research are previously presented webinars on the topic of talent management by Dave Close of MSU and John Healy of Kelly Services, as well as a webinar on purchasing by Dave Freyer, also of MSU, and Jeff Gee of Steelcase. In another webinar, Steve Melnick of MSU and Lars Magnusson of Ericsson, one that was presented in March of this year on sustainability, they provide insight into things that we were hearing from our focal companies on the issue of sustainability. My co-presenter today, Judy Whipple, along with Tom Glazer of VF Corporation, presented a webinar a few months back on strategic initiatives that's also available through APICS. The most recent BTH webinar before this one, this past July, was with myself and Kelly Lynch of Fiat Chrysler America and relates the findings of the research related to supply chain complexity. In addition to the webinars, there's also been a series of detailed white papers created by APICS on each of a set of magazine topics. Those magazine topics have addressed such things as the overall BTH project, as well as the bridge model, the topic of what we call insomnia, or what are the issues that are keeping supply chain execs up at night, as well as purchasing. The second phase of the research, which we're going to really focus a little bit more on today, was an online survey where we surveyed a predominantly North American manufacturer base to examine linkages between competencies, capabilities, and performance, which Judy will give us some more details on now.
As Stan mentioned, the second phase of this research project involved developing an online survey which was sent to APICS members and MSU Supply Chain Management contact list and supplemented with additional responses garnered through market research firms. We received 336 total responses. We had a rich and diverse survey population, as we'll see in a minute. The majority of the firms in the sample were manufacturers, while the remaining were predominantly retailers. I would also like to note that survey respondents were not asked to provide their identity, so in that sense, respondents are anonymous. So that gives you some background on the second phase of this research. The agenda for today's webinar is to focus more specifically on the survey results. We'll begin by examining the demographics of the survey participants. Next, we'll focus on the competencies and capabilities that firms in the survey developed. And finally, we'll examine how those supply chain competencies and capabilities lead to enhanced performance. As shown in this slide, our respondents were highly placed executives. Approximately 43% of the respondents hold CEO president level positions, 18% hold senior vice president level positions, and the remaining 39% hold director positions. The scope of responsibility for the respondents was also varied, with 34% having production manufacturing responsibility, 30% having responsibility for logistics, 21% for overall supply chain management, and the remaining 15% held procurement positions. Additionally, to provide information at the firm level, a range of different size companies were included, with large companies well represented. 30% of the firms were smaller with sales under $250 million. 41% had sales in the 250 million to 1 billion category, and 29% were larger firms with over $1 billion in sales. Looking at the number of employees, we see a mix of different size companies as well. Approximately 27% of respondents were at firms employing fewer than 250 people, 27% with 250 to 1,000 employees, 31% with 1,000 to 10,000 employees, and the remaining 15% of the respondents were at firms with over 10,000 employees. Respondents were also asked about their firm's corporate strategy. Approximately 18% of the respondents indicated cost leadership was their firm's primary strategic focus. In these cases, the strategy is to create a low-cost supply chain which enables the firm to be the low-cost provider. About 35% of the respondents indicated that their firms employed a differentiated service value strategy. In these cases, firms are focused on offering some form of value-added product, service, or solution that differentiates them from their competitors in the marketplace. The remaining 47% of respondents indicated that their firms use a mix of the two approaches. It may be that these firms have product lines that compete in multiple markets, for example, a basic line and a premium market brand, or that these firms have multiple business units where some business units are more cost-focused and other business units are focused on competing in niche markets. For example, a firm could sell both food and beverage products and perhaps compete on cost in that division, but also high-end electronics or apparel that would offer differentiation. We also wanted to understand the participating firms' organizational reporting structures. 29% of the respondents indicated their structures were centralized, 36% indicated they had a decentralized reporting structure, and 35% were employing a matrix structure. A highly centralized structure may also be considered as a functional model. This structure is typical in smaller companies that have one dominant business or in companies that have multiple business units, but those businesses are so related that they use common products, materials, and processing technologies. Generally, in a centralized structure, a wide scope of supply chain activities reside under a single executive office. However, certain activities, in many cases, for example, purchasing, may report up through a different office, such as finance. Centralized control provides the opportunity to eliminate redundancies across the businesses and to pool resources in ways that create economies of scale. Decentralized structures, on the other hand, attempt to promote localized control at that business unit or local regional level. Decentralized structures are typically found in firms that have a strong focus on product or customer differentiation. By allocating responsibility and authority to lower levels in the organization, a decentralized structure can promote responsiveness and flexibility. Finally, matrix structures combine the benefits of centralization and decentralization by combining both local and global reporting structures, with the aim of balancing the need to effectively support the specific requirements of different divisions or regions, that's that local piece, against the opportunities for synergy where commonality exists across the divisions, and that represents the global portion. Stan will now talk about the development of supply chain capabilities and competencies.
Thank you, Judy. Now we're going to turn our focus to what our respondents said and the ideas that they supported now that we've heard who those respondents were and what their qualifications were. As we discussed earlier in the bridge model, we're focused upon competencies, capabilities, and practices. So let's look at competencies. Competencies, if you'll recall from that bridge model, are the broad set of skills, knowledge, and aptitude that create and sustain the supply chain. And were in part supported in our discussion with 50 companies that we interviewed. There appears to be a set of competencies that firms pursue on the way to striving for that increased performance. Competencies are created through these groups of capabilities coming together. And we've defined capabilities as the infrastructure, processes, systems, assets, and resources that contribute to a specific competency. The practices are what feed into those capabilities. So practices are the specific activities engaged in by the organization to achieve supply chain goals and objectives. From a ground-up perspective, these practices are the things that we'd recognize by sight out in the shop or the warehouse or on the manufacturing floor. We'll see what an example of these practices leading into capabilities actually looks like in our next slide. So here I've gone ahead and populated the notional relationship shown in the previous slide with actual practices we asked survey respondents about, and the name we've assigned to that resultant capability. As you can see, we've got 4 different practices that we asked the respondents about, and when we ran the statistics, these 4 practices were correlated with each other quite highly, meaning that increases or decreases in one of these practices was usually associated with increases or decreases in the other practices. Essentially, they moved together to some degree. Now, it wasn't perfect coordination, but in general, they were moving in concert with each other. As we looked at these practices, we asked ourselves, what are these practices about that are moving with each other, and trying to see what pattern if we could. And we see here that this is a lot of risk management practices. And further, we see that these are much on the senior management and strategic end of the risk management ideas. So I'm going to hand it back to Judy, and she's going to tell you from a higher perspective what some of the other supply chain capabilities we uncovered in our survey.
Based on an extensive literature review and the in-depth interviews from the first phase of the Beyond the Horizon research project, we identified 24 different capabilities such as risk management, compliance, top management support, and financial integration. For each of these capabilities, we also developed a list of their associated practices. Stan's previous example of risk management highlights our approach. Survey respondents completed a series of questions regarding each practice to determine the level of agreement or disagreement that their firm implemented each practice. Based on the analysis, 17 of the original 24 capabilities were shown to be drivers of performance. These 17 capabilities, shown here, were factor analyzed, and based on that analysis, were bundled into 6 supply chain competencies. While many of these capabilities are self-explanatory, I'd like to highlight a few and describe their associated practices. Complexity simplification illustrates practices used by firms to simplify and reduce duplicative processes. Complexity simplification involves reducing products and services that do not meet revenue and sales targets and are no longer desired by key customers. Supply-based rationalization is also considered as a means for complexity simplification. Another item, internal process connectivity, illustrates practices used internally within a firm to develop commonality across processes and people, while also supporting common standards and promoting common goals. Internal process connectivity enables firms to reduce that siloed mentality while encouraging cross-functional integration. Internal process simplification, similar to complexity simplification, focuses on streamlining internal processes. In this case, the focus was not only on internal operational complexity, but also product redesign and removing waste from internal processes and systems. Customer relevancy and responsiveness, respectively, focus on ways a firm can enhance customer integration. In the case of relevancy, it is the practices a firm undertakes to ensure products and service strategies adapt to ever-changing customer needs. Responsiveness enables performing specific requests and offering a wide range of customized products and services to respond to and integrate with key customers. Structural adaptation examines the ability for the firm to maintain a flexible and change-ready distribution network to respond quickly to market changes. This capability is linked with internal process simplification and connectivity. Similar to the importance of integrating with customers, supplier collaboration, supplier management, and supplier strategic alignment are capabilities firms develop to improve supplier relationships. These capabilities entail not only working closely with key suppliers on resolving operational problems, but also ensuring a strong supply base is maintained that aids in the firm's competitive advantage and involves suppliers early in the design and new product development process. Finally, talent management, which includes not only talent recruiting but also talent development, is a critical aspect given the shortage of supply chain talent at all levels, not only entry level but also middle and top management levels. In this case, it's not only important to recruit talent, but also to maintain that talent and create career development opportunities. As we've described, competencies are the bundle of capabilities. The 17 capabilities discussed on the previous slide were factor analyzed, and based on that analysis, were bundled into 6 supply chain competencies. Combining capabilities in these unique ways has a synergistic effect. They become more important when combined to form that strategic competency. For example, integration is a competency that is widely accepted as desirable, and many firms work to achieve various types of integration. In our case, we saw several competencies around integration, including corporate strategic integration, which we see here is a set of abilities of the organization to promote senior management support and ensure compliance with the strategic vision. We also saw external integration with customers, as we see here, and as we'll see on the next slide, with suppliers. In this case, customer integration is focused on creating abilities for the organization to segment and communicate with customers while promoting relevancy and responsiveness. And finally, another key piece of integration is internal integration, which allows an organization to adapt its internal structure, reduce complexity, and increase internal process connectivity. On this slide, we see the remaining 3 competencies. One was resource management, which is focused on the abilities of the organization to secure and manage critical resources. Those resources could be materials, components, services, as well as supply chain talent. Here we see the other integration piece, external integration, where we're focused on integrating with our suppliers. This enables us to manage the supply base and collaborate and strategically align with key suppliers when necessary. Finally, technology and planning integration is another means of internal integration, where the organization seeks to manage information, promote technological connectivity, and work to plan the supply chain.
As Judy described, we ended up detecting 6 competencies. We're ultimately looking for how those result in performance. In general, our hope was to find relationships between capabilities and competencies and performance. Ultimately, as managers and leaders, our charge is to, if you will, move the needle on some performance measure. So we're looking to see what capabilities appeared in the eyes of our respondents to result in competency creation and ultimately produce outcomes that we and our stakeholders care about, like performance. So we asked our survey participants to gauge how they felt their organizations performed. We gave them a 5-point scale anchored on the low end with the statement, supply chain management is not a strength relative to the industry for their organization. And on the high end, it was anchored with the statement, my firm is one of the few supply chain management leaders in industry. Once we'd asked them where their firm was located on this scale, and you'd be surprised, people were fairly hard on themselves at times, we broke these groups into 2 separate groups, a high supply chain strength group and a low supply chain strength group. And then we asked them about a variety of other more traditional measures, which appear on the bottom half of the chart. And here you see many of the traditional financial and operational measures that we all track. The next thing we did was, looking only at the supply chain strength measure I just talked about, we segmented those groups into the highs and lows as discussed, and then compared their performance on those competencies that Judy walked you through a few minutes ago. We did fairly simple t-tests for those statistics people in the audience, but we saw a clear difference in their creation upon those competencies, based upon whether they were high or low in supply chain strength respondent. For instance, looking at the competency resource management, we see the respondents on the low end of supply chain strength were lower than their high supply chain strength peers with regards to resource management. Now, recall, we never directly asked them about resource management. Instead, we asked them about various practices which lead to capabilities and ultimately to competencies like resource management. So what we're seeing here essentially is that firms higher on supply chain strength also engage more in the practices that led to our various competencies. Also note on the bottom of the slide that overall financial performance also showed this effect, further solidifying the expectations of the research group that better supply chain practices not only lead to a better performing supply chain, they lead to positive financial outcomes as well. As we dug in even further, we found a number of other findings. As far as sales are concerned, our low supply chain strength firms generally reported low to medium annual sales, while those feeling that they had more supply chain strength were reporting medium to high annual sales. Related to the reporting structures, we saw that by and large, firms reporting lower supply chain strength were typically also those firms that employed a centralized structure. Although some were decentralized, we see a lot of them were centralized. The high supply chain strength firms were also sometimes decentralized in their structure, but many were also reporting using a matrixed organization structure. On the strategy front, we again saw differences between our low and high supply chain strength firms, with the low strength firms typically being more cost-focused, while the higher performing supply chain strength firms were usually using a differentiation strategy or a mix of those strategies. Essentially, the cost-based approach does not seem to be correlating with high supply chain strength. As you can see, we also considered the impact of firm type, but saw no differences there.
As Stan discussed, supply chain strength was related to higher engagement in practices that led to our 6 competencies. However, we also wanted to examine the relationship between competencies and performance outcomes. This chart illustrates the results of regression analysis, which was run to determine the influence that the 6 competencies had on all performance measures as a whole. Regression examines the strength of the relationship between 2 variables, again, in this case, the competencies and the performance outcomes. The results illustrate that the 6 competencies contribute significantly to those performance outcomes. Let me take a minute to explain the financial performance measure in a bit more detail. We asked participants to rate their firm on different financial performance measures in comparison to their competitors. So, for example, in profit margin, we asked participants to indicate if their firm's profit margin was better or worse than the competitors. The endpoints for the 7-point scale had the following anchors. 1 was that their profit margin was much worse than competitors. 7 was that their profit margin was much better than competitors. As mentioned previously, we then created an overall financial performance measure score, which combined the scores of each of the 9 individual financial measures shown here. That overall financial performance measure was calculated, and using the average score, we divided the sample into 2 groups, lower overall financial performance and higher overall financial performance. This chart illustrates the low overall financial performance group in blue and the high overall financial performance group in red, and each group's average score on each of the 9 individual performance measures. Here we wanted to take a look at whether or not there were 1 or 2 individual financial measures that significantly drove overall financial performance. As you can see from this chart, first of all, high overall financial performance was higher on all 9 financial measures. So that group was statistically significantly higher on each of these individual 9 financial performance measures than the low overall performance group. And you can see that in general, the high group scored 6.5 on average or above on a 7-point scale for each of these 9 individual measures. The low overall performance group is generally around 5 on average on that 7-point scale. The other thing that this chart illustrates is that there was not 1 or 2 particular financial measures that had an overriding effect. In other words, to be in the high overall performance group, a firm could not maximize in one financial measure, but rather they had to display a well-rounded focus across the full set of performance measures. As we discussed previously, we looked at all 6 competencies in total and the impact that these competencies had on performance measures. And we showed that there was a strong relationship between all 6 competencies and all performance measures. What we show here on this slide is we want to examine the impact of each of the 6 competencies individually on each performance measure, treating the performance measures independently. In this case, we use stepwise regression, which highlights which competencies have the greatest influence on each of the individual performance measures. For example, with respect to sales growth, only 2 competencies influence sales growth in a significant manner. Those 2 competencies are resource management and supplier integration. On the other hand, ROI is affected first significantly by internal integration, followed second by resource management. So in this chart, we've highlighted the first most important factor in bright green and the second most important factor in light green. Not only do we look at each individual performance measure, but we also look at the overall performance average, where customer integration is first, resource management is second, and in this case, corporate strategic integration is also an important competency driving overall financial performance. We also see that we've included that supply chain strength measure that Stan talked about previously. And so technology planning integration is the first factor contributing to supply chain strength, followed by resource management. So you can see from this chart that resource management and customer integration are both pretty significant drivers of the various individual performance measures. Technology and planning integration is only a key factor in supply chain strength. Corporate strategic integration is not a first or second leading factor, but it is an important factor coming in third in ROI, asset management, and overall performance.
So regarding our implications, how do we back up and learn from what we saw? Resource management is key, as you saw in the chart that Judy just presented. Throughout this project, we've heard that firms that organize resources better perform better. While the data at hand clearly shows the impact of physical resource management, I think it's important to note that one of the other key takeaways of the overall research project has been on talent, a key resource in any supply chain. I focus specifically on talent because there's actually another APICS webinar available through the Beyond the Horizons project that focuses entirely upon talent management issues, and you might want to watch it if you haven't already. The webinar talks about recruiting, developing, and retaining people in our supply chains, issues that a shifting workforce demographic has made even more important as younger, more mobile, technical workforce is becoming the majority within our supply chains. Integration is also clearly important. We find that firms that work more easily internally as well as externally spend less time putting out fires and more time performing. The research shows not only the importance of those cross-functional integration elements and strategic integration to balance supply and demand across the supply chain, but also how integrating with key customers and suppliers has benefits for the supply chain and ultimately performance. Essentially, integrating our operations appears to, as expected, lead to better overall performance. Lastly, within the integration space, there's special need to integrate our planning and our technology, and we saw differences in supply chain strength for those firms that were better in this key important area.
To build off Stan's comments on the implications, we'd like to provide some concluding thoughts. Before that, I would also like to mention that there will be an article in the November-December APICS magazine highlighting the survey results. In terms of concluding thoughts, it's clear from the research that high financially performing firms also have high-performing supply chains. Supply chain performance is demonstrated by above average investment in the practices and capabilities that bundled together to form the 6 competencies that we looked at. Those competencies, again, are resource management, internal integration, customer integration, supplier integration, corporate strategic integration, and technological and planning integration. Interestingly, these competencies resonate very succinctly with the results of the first phase of this research. For example, with respect to integration, the majority of the 50 firms we interviewed were engaged in some high-level initiative to increase integration somewhere in their supply chain. As often we saw, that high-level initiative focused on supplier integration, where firms were seeking to develop more collaborative relationships with suppliers that would result in early supplier involvement that enabled co-creation of value and resulted in the buying firm becoming a customer of choice. This becomes significantly more critical when, for example, there are resource shortages or consolidation of expertise within the supply base. Becoming a customer of choice enables a buying firm to secure supply and expertise in constrained markets. Internal integration initiatives involved, similar to the survey results, efforts to increase information connectivity and improve the demand-supply planning process. For example, many of the firms in the in-depth interviews described efforts to improve their sales and operation planning processes. Another conclusion from the research is that supply chain strength. That is, being an industry leader in supply chain also pays off. Firms that illustrated high supply chain strengths were also the ones that excelled in terms of financial performance, as well as displaying high levels of competency across all 6 competency areas. While supply chain strength was more likely to be associated with larger sized firms, decentralized or matrix reporting structures, and differentiated or mixed strategic approaches, some firms outside those parameters were also able to achieve high supply chain strength. This illustrates that any firm is capable of being a high performer by developing the practices and capabilities that lead to the core competencies addressed here.
And Judy, I'm going to jump in kind of like you did, where you looked at something that we saw from phase 1 and kind of tie it in with phase 2. One of the connections is between complexity and collaboration and an integration. In the interviews, we heard a lot from our research partners about all the struggles they were having with supply chain complexity. In particular, they were trying to handle desired increases for speed, asset visibility, product assortment, product customization from their customers, and it's putting strains upon their, and I imagine those of you in this webinar, your supply chains. Well, one of the other complicating factors we heard about were pressures of dealing with more global customer base and operating in locations that they hadn't been before, as well as a more globalized supply base, in part to address that more globalized customer base. Well, as we talked to those firms in that first phase, we asked them, how are you dealing with all of this increased complexity? And one of the remedies they mentioned, and which resurfaced in the survey we saw today, was integration. Now, I will say the key takeaway solution that people had when we were interviewing our research partners was to avoid complexity altogether. And you heard Judy mention the importance of simplification earlier. But when that isn't the full solution, our research interviewees talked at length about the importance of supplier collaboration. In particular, they were clear that having the right decision makers involved in key decisions helped, as well as working to make sure that firms understood the impact of their systems and processes upon their suppliers, as well as making sure that their suppliers understood the importance of the output that they generate, be it physical items or the information that's the input to your supply chain. But the role of the quality in those things that they have in supply chain performance is really important. So bringing it back to integration, which we've talked a bit more about today, we heard from the companies we talked to face-to-face that collaboration and integration is fundamental to the performance. And in today's webinar, we've again seen, this time from survey respondents, that firms' ability to integrate with their customers and suppliers leads to improvement in supply chain performance as well as overall financial performance. So lastly, let's return to our bridge model for just a moment. You'll recall that we proposed that structure, strategy, and those practices we've talked about today led to capabilities, which in turn lead to competencies. On the way across that bridge to performance, firms need to create these capabilities and competencies. And what we're seeing from the survey discussed today is that 5 of the 6 key competencies we found related in some way to integration. We think it's pretty clear at this point that given the linkage between competencies and improved performance and the ability of the supply chain to better integrate from original supplier through the focal firm and onto the ultimate customer and back in some cases, is fundamental to a high-performing supply chain. Okay, well that's a lot of information in a pretty short period of time. So what we'd like to do now is turn it back over to Jennifer, and she's going to go ahead and start us out on our Q&A session. It looks like we've got some time for questions, so go ahead and let us know what you'd like to hear more about.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you, Judy, for that great presentation. And like Stan said, we will now have our Q&A session. As a reminder, you can type your question in the questions box that should be on your GoToWebinar toolbar. And we'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Okay, our first question, sorry, is does the equal distribution of firms based on the organizational chart you guys showed suggest that each of the structures is equally beneficial? Oh, sorry, let me turn your mic. There we go. Sorry, Stan, did you guys hear that one, guys?
No problem.
Sure. So one thing I'll mention on that is just to be clear, we did not have that equal distribution of org structure or organization reporting structure by design. That just happened to be the respondent base, happened to be roughly equal across those reporting options. However, I will say that all structures can be effective. With this sample, we did find a higher proportion of the firms that had high supply chain strength were more likely to be decentralized or matrix structures. However, some of those high supply chain strength firms were centralized structures. So I think there's potential for all structures to be effective, but it often depends a lot on the type of firm. For example, smaller firms or firms that have single or predominant business units are often more likely to be centralized, whereas large conglomerates are often more likely to be matrix structures. Additionally, related to strategy, we found that firms that are centralized or are often more cost-focused from a strategy perspective, whereas firms that tend to need more flexibility and responsiveness in their strategy tend to be more likely to be decentralized. Of course, matrix could be in either of those cases. So we often find that the firm's strategy affects that reporting structure. Again, so if your strategy, for example, is more cost-focused, you might have a more centralized structure, and then depending on how well you implement that strategy through that structure will affect your overall performance.
Great, thank you, Judy. And then I think I'll pass the next question over to Stan. So Stan, Massimiliano asks, when a firm is facing a decline because of a market share or production issues or poor customer service, based on your research, would you guys say it's better to hire individuals who have different or disruptive capabilities, or to hire somebody who has a better fit with how the firm currently operates?
Yeah, I think I mean, again, like Judy's saying, there's probably no perfect answer to everything, but I would say that if the KPIs in the organization are not going the direction you want, adding more units of the same is probably an approach that, you know, as well. And there's a little bit of, you know, work that kind of backs that up if you get into the social network area to talk about things like, you know, often if your KPIs are not going well, maybe what you need is some, you know, disruption, if you will, positive disruption to the way that business is going. And the research has been pretty clear that there's value in bringing in new ideas, innovations, if you will, brought about by creating new opportunities within your network for those ideas to come out. And so what I mean by that is if you've got a network of 5 or 6 companies that have been working together, or 5 or 6 people on a project that have been working together for a really long time, and the outcomes are not good, to get new ideas into that group, you've got to bring people with distinct, different information behind them to do that. And so bringing someone new in on the project or a new supplier into your network often introduces novel information that the current group, because they've been working together, just don't have. And it's not their fault that they don't have it, but they've been grinding on the task at hand, and maybe they're not out doing surveillance, if you will, on what new types of ideas might be out there. And that innovation isn't just product innovation. It may be process innovation. Someone may come in with a new way to run one type of system or another, and so as you start to dig into innovation itself, there's many different types of innovation, and certainly new people, new questions being asked of the same old people often tend to start to ask us to reflect on things and maybe consider if there isn't some better way. Will it be a golden bullet? No, not, but it might at least unpack, some of the things that we've kind of just believed have to be the way they are, and ask us to challenge those assumptions.
Great, thanks, Dan. Our next question comes from Giorgio, and Giorgio says, can we say that a supply chain leader should be at the right-hand man of every CEO?
Well, I think as a couple
we might be biased.
Yeah, we may be biased as supply chain educators, but we certainly think so, and it seems as though the trend in the last few years is we're seeing the importance of the supply chain, function, if you will, elevated within companies. And if you want to go look at who's running Apple today as a great example, Tim Cook is a dyed-in-the-wool supply chain person. And is elevated to the head of the largest market capitalization company in the world. So we certainly think so, but as Judy says, we may be somewhat biased in that perception as well.
Well, I like that answer anyway, so thanks, guys. Our next question is capabilities risk management considered the same as a business contingency plan?
Well, excuse me. I think certainly part of many companies' risk management programs are also understanding and developing contingencies around potential risks. In this case, the risk management constructs that we looked at were the ones that Stan highlighted on slide 17. So in this case, we were looking at, does senior management view supply chain risk as necessary for protecting the brand? Do they have some corporate level strategies to manage risk? And do they consider that part of their firm's competitive advantage? And do they support risk management initiatives? With respect to that contingency plan, that certainly could be one of many particular risk management initiatives that a firm could be looking at. But certainly when we look at studying risk in other research that we've done, contingency planning becomes a piece of that. But before you can contingency plan, oftentimes you also have to understand where those risks may occur. And so we look at things like what is where are potential risks, in the sense where are we weakest in our supply chain, because our supply chain is only as good as that weakest link. So where are risks? What's the potential likelihood that that risk could happen? What's the potential impact that that risk could, how could it potentially impact our operations? And then I think another key element of that is what type of detection measures do we have to identify that potential risk in time to respond to it? Where the contingencies come in is in that what are the responses we can take given different impacts that the risk might have.
Great, thanks, Judy. Our next question comes from Henry, and Henry asks, did the research results highlight key supply chain planning talent capabilities for high-performing organizations?
So certainly there's been a lot of interest in supply chain talent improvement over the last 5 years. In the case of the capability in this example, talent recruitment and development were part of that resource management competency. And so talent development, talent recruiting were capabilities that led into resource management as a competency. So we do see firms in the survey being very focused on improving how they get talent into the organization, as well as how they keep and retain and develop talent once they're in the organization. So we've seen a lot of information on talent, not just with this survey, but also with the interviews that represented the first phase of this research. And certainly companies are recognizing and understanding that there is a talent shortage out there in supply chain and looking for ways to improve recruiting practices, but once you recruit them, you got to keep them, because as you improve their knowledge and capabilities, they become very attractive for your competitors.
One of the other things in it, as Judy said, came more out of the first phase of the research than the survey part as it relates to that keeping people in the talent space, is in talking with companies that have been doing supply chain talent hiring, as well as some of the service providers, if you will, of supply chain and other types of talent. What we've been hearing is that the talent, us, the people doing the work, there's a bit of a shift in mindset that workers coming into the workforce now have, that if you think about the 25 to 35-year-old workforce, a lot of those folks have seen their parents downsized, right-sized, outsized, whatever term you want to use. And so the long-held mindset of a lot of the older folks in the workforce of you come, you work for 30 years, you get a gold watch when you leave. Those days are pretty long gone. And in the second stage of that, those days are long gone, is what we're hearing is that more and more of the workforce is looking at a job as an ability to add some skills to their portfolio, and once that skill attainment is achieved, be it experience or education or whatever it might be, that the portability of that workforce it's almost multiplying upon itself, if you will, that people are moving more often and they're becoming more comfortable with that. And so it puts a pressure on recruitment. You got to get them in, because so many of them are leaving to go off and do other things. So on finding a way when they're in the job and might be open to staying, you keep them engaged, you put them on interesting projects, because otherwise, we've all heard the stories about how many jobs are available. People know they can go somewhere else easily, and if they're willing to be portable, the market is clearly supportive of that, just because of the increased demand for supply chain talent, if nothing else.
I think the other thing we've seen for companies, building off of Stan's comment, is really focusing on helping individuals build career map templates, because again, I'm coming in wanting a particular skill or experience, and oftentimes we hear this from our own recent alums who talk about, I came in to do a particular thing and I think I've mastered that skill, and now it's not clear to me what new skill I should develop or what the process is for moving. And that's not to suggest that they're trying to move up too quickly, although from time to time that may be the case, but just understanding that there is a career map that they are a part of developing and designing is another way to improve that internal development, but also keep them focused on new skill sets, new opportunities, new challenges within the firm.
Great. Well, thank you both for that feedback. We have time for one more question, and we have our attendee, Brett. He had kind of a critical analysis question for you guys of your work. He said, looking back at your study, is there anything you would have done differently based on knowing now how supply chain has evolved since you started this study?
One of the, I think looking back, the first phase of the research with the in-depth interviews, I would say no. I think that part of the element of that survey design was to get them thinking about not just what they're dealing with today, but what they're seeing is on the horizon in the next 2 to 5 years. And so I think I wouldn't change that process, but maybe it needs to be revisited more frequently, because technology and change management is happening so quickly.
The other thing is, the first part was these guided interviews. The second part was a survey that was based on what we learned in the first phase. We rolled that into more easily answerable by large groups of people type of stuff in the survey. And so I don't know that we would go back and change things, but that cycle And anytime you get done asking a set of questions, I mean, think about your own experiences. You ask somebody a question, you get an answer, and the next thing you know, you've got another question after that. I think it's the same kind of thing here. We use phase 1 to create the survey for phase 2. We've gone through the survey for phase 2 and got some of the results, the types of things we talked about today. We're now left with a whole bunch of more questions on, okay, well, now where's the next stage for this to go to? So I don't know that it's a jump in a time machine and do it differently as much as it's at each stage you almost end up asking more questions after you hear the answer than before you first started.
Yeah. I think the other thing is we certainly had to make some decisions on the survey of balancing between a survey that's not too long to dissuade people from participating, and so ideally if we could have had another probably 3 pages of questions, we would have. So we had to make some cuts on some topics that we would have liked more feedback on. For example, reverse logistics returns management is another example. So unfortunately, you have to sometimes make cuts between having more information that you can glean from the survey versus having a reasonable survey that participants are willing to take the time to answer.
Well, very good responses. Thank you so much, guys. So on behalf of APICS, I'd like to formally thank Stan and Judy for their time today and their hard work on this presentation, and all of our attendees for listening in today. I hope you'll consider joining us at our next Beyond the Horizon webinar, which will take place on November 17th at 1 p.m. Central Time, which is the same time as today's presentation. If you'd like to register for that, please visit apics.org/online-events. Also, I hope you'll consider taking our short survey after this webinar. It's 5 questions, shouldn't take you more than a few minutes. Just tell us how we did and how we can improve for our future webinars. All content and materials included in this edition of the APICS webinar are the property of APICS and Michigan State University and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. Thank you again for joining us and have a great rest of your day.